The showroom floor was buzzing with energy. Customers browsing, salesmen circling like vultures, and the scent of freshly waxed luxury vehicles hanging in the air. But when James walked in, the atmosphere shifted. A few heads turned, some eyes lingered, but not in admiration. Dressed in a simple button-down shirt, worn-out jeans, and scuffed sneakers, he didn't look like the type to belong in a high-end car dealership. From behind a sleek black BMW, Carl Whitman, the top salesman, smirked as he nudged his colleague. "Watch this," he whispered, his voice dripping with amusement. "Another window shopper wasting my time." James, unaware of the condescending glances, approached a gleaming red Mercedes-Benz S-Class. He ran his fingers lightly along the hood, admiring the craftsmanship. He had worked for this moment, sacrificed, struggled, and climbed his way up from nothing. Today was the day he rewarded himself. A shadow loomed over him. "Can I help you?" Carl's voice was flat, uninterested. His fake customer service smile barely masked his disdain. "Yes," James said with friendly nod. "I'm interested in this one." Carl crossed his arms and chuckled. "You sure about that? This is the S-Class. It's not exactly budget-friendly." James met his gaze without flinching. "I know what it is. Can I take a look inside?" Carl sighed dramatically and pulled the door open. "Go ahead, but let's not waste each other's time, all right? This car starts at $120,000. James slid into the plush leather seat, running his hands over the steering wheel. It felt right. It felt earned. But Carl's impatient tapping on the roof pulled him out of the moment. "Sir," Carl said slowly as if speaking to a child, "we do have some more affordable options in the back. Maybe a used Corolla?" James exhaled sharply, biting back the sting of humiliation. He had heard it all before. The assumption, the doubt, the casual dismissal. He had spent years proving people wrong, and today would be no different. He stepped out of the car and faced Carl. "I didn't ask for a Corolla." Carl raised his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, I'm just trying to help. I see this happen all the time. Someone gets their hopes up only to be disappointed when reality hits." James tilted his head. "Reality?" Carl leaned in slightly. "Look, man, I get it. We all have dreams. But this," he gestured to the Mercedes with a smug grin, "it's just not in the cards for everyone." James studied him for a long moment. Then, with calculated ease, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out his checkbook. Carl's smirk faltered. "Reality is," James said, flipping it open, "I can buy this car in cash." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Carl's face, but he recovered quickly. "Sure you can," he scoffed, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "But—" James didn't let him finish. He scrawled his name across the check and tore it out. "I'll take it," he said, holding it up. Carl's eyes darted between the check and James's face. I need to get this approved by my manager." His voice cracked just slightly. "Go ahead," James said coolly. "Take your time." Carl practically sprinted toward the office, the check clenched in his fist. The showroom, once oblivious, had gone silent. Eyes followed him. Whispers began to spread. James leaned against the car, a small smile playing on his lips. He had seen this scenario play out 1,000 times in his head. The doubt, the humiliation, only for the tables to turn. But this wasn't just about proving a point. This was about every moment he had been underestimated, every door that had been shut in his face, every person who had looked at him and assumed he was less. Minutes passed. Carl returned, his face pale. Behind him, the dealership manager, Mr. Reynolds, approached with an uncomfortable smile. "Mr. James," Reynolds said, clearing his throat, I apologize for any misunderstanding. Carl here tells me you're interested in purchasing the S-Class." James folded his arms. "I don't know, Mr. Reynolds. Your top salesman seemed pretty convinced I couldn't afford it." Reynolds shot Carl a glare before turning back to James. "That's absolutely not how we do business here. Carl made a terrible mistake." James held his gaze. "Mistake?" Carl shifted uncomfortably, sweat beading on his forehead. I didn't mean anything by it, man. Just, try to save you some trouble." James cut him off. "Did you judge everyone like that today? Or just me? Carl opened his mouth, but closed it again at a loss for words. Reynolds cleared his throat again. I'd be happy to personally complete the transaction for you, Mr. James. And of course, we'll throw in a complimentary service package. James chuckled softly, shaking his head. Oh, I don't need a service package. He looked at Carl, then back at Reynolds. What I need is for you to train your employees to treat every customer with respect. Reynolds nodded quickly. Absolutely. Consider it done. James let the silence stretch before speaking again. Good. He tapped the hood of the car. And one more thing. Reynolds tensed. Yes. James turned to Carl, his expression unreadable. I want him to be the one to hand me the keys. Carl's stomach dropped. James held out his palm expectantly, waiting. The entire dealership watched in stunned silence as Carl, the arrogant top salesman, now stood frozen, forced to acknowledge the man he had dismissed just moments ago. And then, the entire dealership watched in stunned silence as Carl, the arrogant top salesman, now stood frozen, forced to acknowledge the man he had dismissed just moments ago. And then, Carl hesitated, his fingers twitching by his side. His jaw clenched as he swallowed his pride, but the humiliation burned hotter than the midday sun streaming through the showroom windows. His hands balled into fists before he finally forced them open and reached into his pocket for the key fob. With a stiff, reluctant motion, he extended it towards James. James didn't take it. Not yet. He let the moment drag, let the weight of Carl's arrogance, now shattered, settle over the entire room. The other salesmen watched in hushed amusement. Customers whispered behind cupped hands, and Reynolds shifted uncomfortably beside them. Finally, James plucked the key from Carl's trembling fingers. Thank you, he said evenly, but there was something in his tone, something razor-sharp and knowing. A quiet power Carl had never recognized before, and now it cut deep. James turned on his heel, moving towards the dealership counter, where the paperwork awaited. Reynolds, desperate to salvage the situation, trailed behind him, offering more incentives, more apologies, more empty words. James barely heard him. He was relishing the shift, the sweet irony of a man who had once dismissed him now scrambling for his approval. Carl, still standing in the same spot, felt a mix of anger and humiliation clawing at his insides. His pride, his reputation. It had all crumbled in mere minutes. And yet, James wasn't done with him. Just as James was about to sign the final document, he paused, tapping the pen against the desk. The entire transaction had been a lesson, but something inside him craved one final stroke of poetic justice. He turned to Carl, eyes locked on the defeated salesman. You work on commission, don't you? James asked, his voice casual, almost conversational. Carl stiffened. Yeah. A slow, knowing smile crept across James's face. Then you won't mind if I request another salesman to finish this up. Carl's face drained of color. W what? James turned to Reynolds. I'd like someone else to get the commission for this sale. Maybe one of your newer guys who actually knows how to treat customers. Reynolds hesitated, glancing at Carl, then back at James. But he knew there was no arguing. Not now. Not after what had just happened. Of course, Mr. James, he said quickly, waving over a younger, eager-looking salesman who had been watching the entire thing with wide eyes. Carl took a step forward. Wait, James didn't even look at him. He simply turned his back and continued the transaction, leaving Carl standing there, seething in silence as someone else pocketed what should have been his hefty commission. By the time James was handed the keys, the power shift was complete. He walked towards his brand-new Mercedes with a calm, collected air, while Carl stood in the background, a broken man who had learned a brutal lesson in humility. But just as James was about to step inside his car, something unexpected happened. A sleek black vehicle pulled up outside the dealership, its tinted windows rolling down just enough to reveal a man in a sharp suit, his expression unreadable. The tension in the room shifted. Even Reynolds, who had been all smiles just moments ago, suddenly looked uneasy. James paused, his fingers hovering over the car door handle. Something about this man's presence sent a ripple of unease through the air. The man stepped out of his car and adjusted his cuffs before slowly making his way toward the entrance. His polished shoes clicked against the pavement, each step measured, deliberate. Carl, still fuming from his public humiliation, suddenly perked up. His expression shifted from frustration to something resembling hope, as if this new arrival meant something important, something that could turn the tide in his favor. James narrowed his eyes. Who was this man? And why did his arrival send a shiver down James's spine? And then the man spoke. His voice was calm. Too calm. "So," he said, his gaze settling on James with an unreadable smirk, "you must be the man who made quite the impression today." James said nothing, but his grip on the key fob tightened. Whatever was about to happen next, he had the distinct feeling that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The man's smirk never wavered as he took another step closer. His suit was crisp, his movements controlled, and his presence alone commanded attention. James could feel the shift in the air, the way the dealership had gone eerily silent, the way even Reynolds seemed to shrink slightly under the weight of this man's presence. James didn't like it. Carl, sensing an opportunity, quickly stepped forward. "Mr. Lancaster, sir, I—" A single raised hand from the suited man silenced him instantly. Carl swallowed hard, stepping back as Lancaster turned his full attention to James. "You certainly made quite the impression here today," Lancaster said, his voice smooth, calculated. "It's not often that someone walks in and changes the entire atmosphere of a place." James remained quiet, studying him. He had met men like this before. Men who thrived on control, on power plays, on intimidation disguised as politeness. Lancaster glanced at the Mercedes. "Beautiful car," he mused, running a hand along the hood. "A strong choice. Demands respect." James finally spoke. "Is there something you want?" Lancaster's smirk widened. Straight to the point. "I respect that." He took a measured step closer. "You see, I own this dealership, and while I encourage success and ambition, I also like to know exactly who I'm dealing with when someone makes a purchase of this magnitude." James raised an eyebrow. "You vet every customer like this, or just the ones who look like me?" A flicker of something unreadable passed through Lancaster's eyes, but he recovered quickly, chuckling. Now, let's not make this about something it's not." James didn't smile. He wasn't in the mood for games. Lancaster took a step back, clasping his hands in front of him. "Tell me, James," he said smoothly. "What do you do?" James tilted his head slightly. "Why does it matter?" Carl, still lurking in the background, let out a quiet snicker. "Maybe because guys like you don't just walk in and buy cars like this without raising a few questions." James turned to him slowly. "Guys like me?" he echoed, his voice dangerously calm. Carl hesitated, but didn't back down. "You know exactly what I mean." Lancaster exhaled, as if he were disappointed in Carl's lack of tact. "What my employee means to say," he interjected, "is that high-end purchases come with high expectations. And I'm simply a man who likes to ensure that his business maintains the right clientele." James's jaw tightened. There it was. The mask had slipped, if only for a moment. "Your business has my money," James said evenly. "Unless you're planning to give it back, I suggest you hand me my title and let me drive off." Lancaster chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Oh, I have no intention of reversing the sale. That would be bad for business." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black card. "However, I do believe in expanding my network." He extended the card toward James. "If you're as successful as you appear to be, I'd love to know more. Perhaps there's an opportunity for us to work together." James didn't take the card. "I'm not interested," he said flatly. Lancaster didn't lower his hand. "Are you sure? It's not every day someone like you gets an invitation from someone like me." The words were subtle, but the meaning was clear. Someone like you. Someone who didn't belong in his world. James took a slow step forward, closing the space between them. His voice was calm, controlled, but the steel in his tone was unmistakable. "You're right," he said. "It's not every day." And with that, he reached out, not for the card, but for Lancaster's hand. He clasped it firmly, holding Lancaster's gaze. Then, slowly, deliberately, He turned his grip, pressing just hard enough to make the handshake uncomfortable. Lancaster's smirk faltered ever so slightly. James leaned in just enough for only Lancaster to hear. But today isn't one of those days. Then he let go. Lancaster pulled his hand back, flexing his fingers slightly. The fake smile back in place, but not as confident as before. He studied James for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "Very well," he said, slipping the card back into his pocket. "Enjoy your new car, Mr. James." James didn't reply. He simply turned, stepping into his Mercedes, the key fob still firm in his grip. The engine roared to life, smooth and powerful, but before he could pull out of the dealership lot, something caught his eye in the rearview mirror. Carl and Lancaster were speaking in hushed tones, their expressions tense. Then Lancaster looked up directly at James, and for the first time, the smirk was gone. Something was off. As James pulled onto the road, his gut told him one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't over. And whatever was coming next, it wasn't going to be good. James drove through the city streets, his mind replaying the encounter at the dealership. Something about Lancaster's demeanor, the way he and Carl had exchanged hushed words, it all felt unfinished. A man like that didn't just let things go. And James had just bruised his ego in front of an entire dealership. He tightened his grip on the wheel, instincts kicking in. He'd learned long ago that power-hungry men hated nothing more than being outmaneuvered. They didn't forget. They didn't forgive. His phone buzzed. A blocked number. James hesitated before answering. "Hello." A pause. Then, "I see why they respect you." Lancaster. James's jaw clenched. "You following me now?" A low chuckle. "I like to know who I'm dealing with." James exhaled sharply, keeping his voice steady. "You already know everything you need to." "Oh, I doubt that." There was a beat of silence before Lancaster continued, his voice taking on a calculated edge. "You see, I did a little research after our discussion, and you're quite the enigma, Mr. James. Wealthy, but no flashy business ventures. Smart, but you don't play by the usual rules. That makes men like me curious." James kept his face neutral, though his pulse had quickened. He knew what this was. A veiled threat. Lancaster was testing him, trying to see if he'd break. But James had spent his life dealing with men who underestimated him. Lancaster was just another name on the list. "So what now?" James asked, his voice cool. "You try to dig up dirt? Find a way to control me." Lancaster chuckled again, but this time there was an undercurrent of frustration. "I don't need to control you. I just needed to know if you were worth the effort." James smirked. "And—" A pause. Then, surprisingly, "I respect it." James blinked, thrown off. That wasn't the response he expected. "What?" "I misjudged you," Lancaster admitted. "You carry yourself like a man who's had to fight for his place in the world. I can respect that. And while I don't like losing, I do appreciate a worthy adversary." James frowned, still wary. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying," Lancaster sighed, "that perhaps I've spent too much time dealing with people who bow to power. You reminded me that not everyone does." James didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure if this was genuine or just another mind game. Then Lancaster added, "I also fired Carl." That made James raise an eyebrow. "You what?" Lancaster exhaled. "The fool embarrassed my dealership, and more importantly, he embarrassed himself. If he had treated you with respect from the start, we wouldn't be having this conversation." James considered this. It wasn't the ending he expected, but it was a fitting one. "So what now?" James asked. "Now," Lancaster said, "now you drive off in that beautiful car of yours and enjoy your evening. And if you ever decide you want to do business, you know where to find me." James shook his head with a smirk. "Not likely." Lancaster chuckled. "I figured as much." The line went dead. James tossed his phone onto the passenger seat, exhaling slowly. The storm had passed. As he pulled up to a red light, he glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror. He had walked into that dealership as a man underestimated, a man dismissed. But now, he was driving away in victory. And somewhere, Carl was learning a hard lesson about respect. James tapped the wheel, letting out a small chuckle. Rude car salesman insults black man. Then he pulls out his checkbook. If you love this story and want to see more powerful narratives where justice is served, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. What would you have done in James's shoes? Drop your thoughts in the comment below. Stay tuned for more inspiring and dramatic stories. Because sometimes the underdog wins in the most unexpected way.